Did you know the famous slide down the pole in Jailhouse Rock was Elvis's own idea? Or that the song's writers, two of the most successful in rock history, wrote the lyrics in about 5 hours because their publisher locked them in a hotel room? And what if the song's most debated line, the one that caused whispers for decades, was just a simple inside joke that got out of hand? Jailhouse Rock wasn't just a hit song. It was a cultural event. It was a lightning rod for the hopes and fears of a generation. And it was, in many ways, the moment Elvis Presley went from, a controversial singer to a full-blown threat to the establishment. Let's look at the reasons why. Number 16, why was the song itself an attack on pop music? The year the song was recorded, 1957, was a time of major transition in popular music. The charts were still dominated by crooners and vocal groups singing polite, often orchestrated songs. Perry Como's Round and Round was a #1 hit that year. Pat Boone was selling millions of records with his clean-cut image. These were songs with smooth melodies, romantic lyrics, and arrangements that wouldn't scare your parents. The production was clean, every instrument in its place. The vocals were polished and clear. The subject matter was almost always love, courtship, or gentle heartbreak. It was safe. Jailhouse Rock was not safe. It was recorded on April 30th, 1957, at Radio Recorders in Hollywood. The session was for the soundtrack of the upcoming movie. The team behind the glass was as important as the man at the microphone. Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller were the songwriters, but they were also there to produce, to shape the sound. This was unusual for movie soundtrack work at the time, where studio producers usually ran the show. But Elvis and his label, RCA, insisted. They knew Lieber and Stoller understood the raw energy Elvis needed. The sound they created was deliberately abrasive. It kicks off not with a gentle piano, but with a punchy, aggressive riff played by Scotty Moore on electric guitar and a thudding piano played by Mike Stoller himself. The rhythm is not a gentle swing. It's a hard, driving 4/4 beat hammered home by DJ Fontana on drums. One of the less known details of the recording is the use of two bass players, Bill Black on his usual stand-up bass and another player reportedly on electric bass to double the bottom end, making it heavier and more powerful than almost anything on the radio. This gave the track a thick, almost menacing low-end rumble. Then there's Elvis's voice. He isn't crooning. He's sneering. He spits out the words with a kind of aggressive swagger. When he sings, "The warden threw a party in the county jail," it doesn't sound like an invitation. It sounds like a dare. He uses vocal hiccups, growls, and a raw energy that was the complete opposite of the polished vocals of his contemporaries. It was a voice that sounded like it had lived a little, a voice that belonged in a back alley, not a pristine recording studio. This vocal style, heavily influenced by the rhythm and blues singers he admired, was jarring to mainstream white audiences. It was too loud, too emotional, too uncontrolled. The song's structure was also unusual. It uses stop-time breaks where the band cuts out completely, leaving Elvis to sing a line a cappella before crashing back in. This technique creates tension and drama. It makes the listener pay attention. It was a common trick in blues and R&B, but it was a shock to the system of mainstream pop. It made the song feel unpredictable and dangerous. The typical pop song of the era had a clear, linear progression. Jailhouse Rock felt like it could fall apart or explode at any moment. The mix itself was different. The slapback echo on Elvis's voice, a signature of his early Sun record sound, was still present, but it was sharper here. It gave his voice a percussive, almost physical quality. The instruments weren't blended into a smooth orchestral wash. They were distinct, loud, and competitive. The drums were loud in the mix, the guitar was sharp, the piano was pounding. It was the sound of a band playing live and loud in a room, not a carefully constructed studio creation. For many adults in 1957, this wasn't music, it was noise. It was an assault on the senses and an attack on the very idea of what a popular song should be. It didn't try to fit in, it kicked the door down. Number 15, was this the end of the wholesome Hollywood hero? The character Elvis played in the movie Jailhouse Rock was named Vince Everett. He was not a nice guy. The film opens with him getting into a bar fight over a woman, and he accidentally kills a man. He goes to prison for manslaughter. In prison, he's sullen, arrogant, and prone to violence. When he gets out, he remains deeply flawed. He's selfish, he uses people, and he treats his love interest, Peggy, played by Judy Tyler, terribly. He is, for all intents and purposes, an anti-hero. This was a radical departure for the star of a major Hollywood musical. In the 1950s, the leading men of movie musicals were people like Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire. They were charming, sophisticated, and fundamentally good. Their characters might have had a problem to solve, like winning a girl's heart, but they were never morally ambiguous. They were gentlemen. Even other rising stars who played rebels like James Dean or Marlon Brando were in serious dramas, not Technicolor musicals. Musicals were supposed to be escapism. They were fantasy worlds where problems were solved with a clever song and a dazzling dance number. Jailhouse Rock shattered that mold. The film presents a gritty, cynical view of the music industry. Vince Everett is not an artist driven by a pure love of music. He's driven by ambition, greed, and a massive chip on his shoulder. The central musical number, the Jailhouse Rock sequence itself, is not a celebration of love or joy. It's an explosion of pent-up frustration and aggression performed by a character who is, at that point in the film, still a convict. The star of the movie is a criminal. This choice to make the protagonist so unlikable was a huge risk for MGM. They were banking on Elvis's star power to overcome the character's flaws, but for many critics and audience members, it was deeply unsettling. It blurred the lines between Elvis, the person, and the character he was playing. Was this angry, violent young man the real Elvis? His public persona was already controversial. This role seemed to confirm the worst fears of the older generation. He wasn't just a singer with suggestive dance moves. He was a symbol of rebellion and disrespect for authority. The controversy wasn't just about the character's criminal record. It was about his attitude. Vince Everett sneers at authority. He's dismissive of tradition. He trusts no one. This was a direct reflection of the growing generation gap of the 1950s. Teenagers felt misunderstood by their parents and the establishment. Vince Everett was a hero for them precisely because he was not a hero to their parents. He didn't ask for approval. He demanded success on his own terms. The film's plot directly fed into the controversy of the song. When people heard Jailhouse Rock on the radio, they didn't just hear a song about a party in a jail. They pictured Elvis as Vince Everett, the sullen, dangerous convict. The song became inseparable from the character. It wasn't just a fun rock and roll tune, it was the anthem of a juvenile delinquent. This made the song far more threatening than if it had been released by a singer with a clean-cut image. It provided a narrative, a face, and a bad attitude to go along with the rebellious sound. It was the complete package of youthful rebellion, and it made the establishment profoundly uncomfortable. Number 14, how did a dance number threaten American values? The Jailhouse Rock production number in the film is arguably the most famous musical sequence of Elvis's career. It's often cited as one of the first true music videos. But in 1957, it was seen as something far more sinister. The choreography, a blend of Elvis's natural movements and ideas from choreographer Alex Romero, was unlike anything mainstream audiences had ever seen from a white male star. It was raw, overtly physical, and seemed to tap into a primal energy that was both thrilling and terrifying. The controversy began with Elvis's body. The way he moved was the focal point. His signature leg shakes, hip swivels, and shoulder shrugs were already notorious from his television appearances. But here, on the big screen, in a carefully choreographed and edited sequence, they were amplified. The camera focuses on his gyrating hips. His movements are sharp, jerky, and explosive. This was not the graceful, fluid dancing of Fred Astaire. This was something else entirely. It was seen by many as lewd and vulgar. Critics used words like obscene and animalistic. The physical expression was so powerful that it overshadowed the music for many viewers. It was a direct challenge to the reserved, buttoned-up body language of 1950s America. The context of the dance was also a major source of controversy. He is performing in a stylized prison cell block, surrounded by other men dressed in prison stripes. The setting is masculine and aggressive. The dancers are not performing a cheerful routine. They are acting out a stylized riot. They slide down poles, jump off bunks, and engage in mock fights. The energy is one of barely contained violence. This was a far cry from the sparkling ballrooms and sunny parks that usually served as the backdrop for musical numbers. The combination of the vulgar dancing and the dangerous setting created an atmosphere of menace. One of the less discussed elements of the choreography is its debt to African American performance styles. Elvis had spent his youth absorbing music and culture from black communities in Tupelo and Memphis. His dance style incorporated moves from blues performers and vaudeville acts that were common in the black community, but had never been seen on such a grand scale by a white audience. This act of cultural transmission was in itself a source of controversy in a deeply segregated America. To many white adults, his dancing looked foreign and primitive, coded language often used to dismiss black culture. They saw it as him bringing a dangerous jungle rhythm into their homes and movie theaters. Furthermore, the dance was a symbol of unchecked rebellion. In this sequence, Elvis, as Vince Everett, is not just singing a song, he is taking control. He commands the space, and the other prisoners become his backup dancers, his gang. He is the leader of the riot. For a society deeply concerned with conformity and respect for authority, this was a powerful and disturbing image. He wasn't just singing a rebellious song, he was leading a rebellion on screen. This visual representation of defiance was far more potent than any lyric. It was a physical manifestation of the rock and roll attitude, and it was seen as a direct threat to social order and the values of the older generation. Number 13 was the most controversial lyric, Just a Joke. "You're the cutest jailbird I ever did see." This line, sung by one male inmate to another in the song's narrative, became a focal point of controversy and speculation for decades. In the rigid social climate of 1957, any hint of homosexuality in mainstream media was taboo. The idea of one man complimenting another man's appearance in this way, especially in a tough, masculine setting like a prison, was shocking. It was subtle enough to fly over many heads, but for those who caught it, it was deeply unsettling. The men behind the lyrics were Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller. They were young, brilliant songwriters from New York who had a deep love for rhythm and blues. They were known for writing clever, witty playlists, short stories set to music for groups like the Coasters. Songs like Yakety Yak and Charlie Brown were filled with humor and sharp observations about teenage life. When they were tasked with writing songs for an Elvis movie called Jailhouse Rock, they approached it with their usual sense of irony. According to Jerry Lieber, the entire concept of Jailhouse Rock was meant to be a parody. They saw the idea of a rock and roll party in a prison as inherently absurd. They filled the lyrics with cartoonish characters and inside jokes. The line, "You're the cutest jailbird I ever did see," was, in their minds, just another part of the joke. Lieber explained in later interviews that he was thinking of the tough guy prison movies of the 1930s and 40s, and the idea of throwing such a soft, almost sweet line into that environment was funny to him. It was a deliberate, ironic wink. He wasn't trying to make a serious statement about prison life or sexuality. He was being a smart aleck. However, the public in 1957 was not in on the joke. Elvis Presley was not seen as an ironic artist. He was seen as a raw, authentic force of nature. When he sang a lyric, his massive audience took it at face value. The subtlety and humor of Lieber and Stoller were largely lost. Instead, the line was interpreted in a few different ways, all of them controversial. Some saw it as a direct, albeit coded, reference to homosexuality. This fed into the idea that rock and roll was a corrupting, decadent influence that promoted immoral behavior. It was proof that Elvis and his music were a threat to traditional family values. For others, the line was just confusing and strange. It didn't fit the tough image of a prison. This dissonance made the song feel even more alien and unpredictable. Why would a man sing that to another man? The lack of a clear conventional explanation made it seem more subversive than it likely was intended to be. The line became a source of whispers and playground rumors. It added another layer of danger to the song. The irony is that Leiber and Stoller, two of the most sophisticated lyricists in rock and roll, had their cleverness backfire. Their attempt at parody was so deadpan that it was mistaken for a serious and therefore shocking statement. The controversy surrounding this single line shows the massive cultural gap between the hip, urban sensibilities of the songwriters and the more conservative, literal-minded mainstream audience. What was a clever joke in a New York hotel room became a cultural flashpoint when it was broadcast across the nation by the world's biggest star. It demonstrated how Elvis's performance could imbue any lyric with a weight and seriousness that its creators never intended. Number 12, why did a prison fight in a song cause a moral panic? Number 47 said to number 3, "You're the cutest jailbird I ever did see." Number 3, he flew right off the handle, and he began to rock. On the surface, the narrative of the song describes a party, but woven into the lyrics is a clear depiction of violence. The interaction between inmates, number 47 and number 3, followed by the line, "The whole rhythm section was the Purple Gang," introduced a level of grit and criminality that was unheard of in a number 1 pop song. This casual reference to a prison fight and a notorious real-life gang was a major source of controversy. The 1950s was a decade gripped by a fear of juvenile delinquency. The post-war boom had created a new teenage culture with its own music, fashion, and attitudes. And many adults saw this new culture as a direct threat to social order. Films like Rebel Without a Cause and Blackboard Jungle, which famously used Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, had already linked rock and roll music with teenage rebellion and violence in the public mind. Jailhouse Rock took this association to a new level. It didn't just accompany a story about rebels, the story of rebellion and violence was right there in the lyrics. The mention of the Purple Gang was particularly shocking. The Purple Gang was a real and incredibly violent Prohibition-era gang of bootleggers and hijackers based in Detroit. They were notorious for their brutality. To an older generation who remembered the headlines, the name Purple Gang was synonymous with organized crime, murder, and corruption. To have them mentioned in a pop song presented as the rhythm section for a prison party was seen as a blatant glorification of criminal life. It was like making a song today and casually name-dropping a famous cartel as the house band. It was insensitive at best and to many a dangerous endorsement of lawlessness. The fight between number 47 and number 3 also played into these fears. The lyric is ambiguous. Why did number 3 fly off the handle? Was he offended by the compliment? Was it a prelude to a brawl? The vagueness allowed listeners to project their own fears onto the song. It suggested a world of casual violence where a simple comment could lead to a physical altercation. This was the exact kind of behavior that parents and authority figures feared was being encouraged by rock and roll music. This lyrical content, combined with the aggressive sound of the music and Elvis's sneering delivery, created a package that seemed to celebrate everything the establishment feared. It wasn't just a song about dancing, it was a song about a violent party thrown for criminals, featuring a famous gang. It normalized and even made cool a world of violence and incarceration. Parent-teacher associations, church groups, and conservative commentators seized on these lyrics as concrete proof of rock and roll's corrupting influence. They argued that songs like Jailhouse Rock were teaching kids to be disrespectful, violent, and to admire criminals. The lyrical content was a weapon for those who wanted to censor or ban rock and roll music entirely. It moved the argument against Elvis from his suggestive dancing to the very words he was singing, making the song a direct challenge to the moral fabric of society. Number 11 was Elvis exploiting black culture or celebrating it. From the very beginning of his career, Elvis Presley was a focal point for the racial tensions of 1950s America. He was a white singer from Mississippi who sang, danced, and dressed in a style that was heavily influenced by African American culture. This was the source of both his incredible appeal and the intense controversy that surrounded him. Jailhouse Rock, both the song and the film performance, brought this controversy to a boiling point. The music itself was the first issue. Rock and roll was a new genre, but its roots were firmly planted in African American rhythm and blues R&B. The driving beat, the 12-bar blues structure, the raw vocal style, these were all hallmarks of R&B music, which had been primarily created by and for black audiences. When Elvis recorded Jailhouse Rock, he was using this musical language. To many white segregationists, this was a cultural crime. They saw rock and roll as race music or jungle music, and they viewed Elvis as a traitor to his race for performing it. He was seen as breaking down the cultural walls of segregation, bringing this dangerous and primitive music to their white teenage children. This view was often expressed in overtly racist terms by conservative preachers and politicians who called for his music to be banned. On the other side of the coin, Elvis also faced criticism from some within the black community. The issue was one of appropriation and economic exploitation. For years, brilliant black artists like Big Mama Thornton, who first recorded Lieber and Stoller's Hound Dog, Little Richard, and Chuck Berry had been creating this music, but they were largely confined to the race records charts and a segregated touring circuit. They saw little of the massive financial rewards that came with mainstream success. Then, a white performer like Elvis comes along, performs in a similar style, and becomes the biggest star in the world. This led to accusations that he was, in essence, stealing black music and selling it to white America without giving proper credit or compensation to its originators. Pat Boone was famous for doing sanitized covers of black artists' songs, often outselling the originals. Elvis was different. He wasn't sanitizing the music, he was inhabiting it, but the economic disparity was still glaring. The Jailhouse Rock dance sequence in the film intensified this debate. As mentioned before, Elvis's dance moves were not from the world of ballroom or ballet. They were a mix of his own invention and moves he had absorbed from watching black performers on Beale Street in Memphis and in traveling shows. The sharp movements, the isolated body parts, the combination of fluidity and aggression, these were elements of African and African American dance traditions. When white audiences saw this on screen, many reacted with a mixture of fascination and revulsion, often using racist language to describe what they were seeing. For those who were critical of Elvis, this was another example of him taking a black cultural art form and using it for his own gain. So, Jailhouse Rock became a battleground for the soul of American culture. For segregationists, it was a symbol of racial mixing and the breakdown of social order. For some cultural critics, it was a prime example of cultural appropriation, where a dominant culture takes from a marginalized one without acknowledgement. And for his fans and supporters, it was a moment of cultural fusion, where Elvis was acting as a bridge, introducing the raw power and excitement of R&B to a massive new audience, and in doing so helping to lay the groundwork for the cultural integration that would come in the following decades. The song and performance did not create these tensions, but they amplified them on a scale never before seen in popular culture. Number 10, how did one performance define a star's entire image? Before Jailhouse Rock, in late 1957, Elvis Presley was already a superstar and a figure of controversy. But his image was still somewhat fragmented. There was the country boy from Tupelo, the polite seer, and Ma'am Kid in interviews. There was the Sun Records rockabilly rebel of That's All Right. There was the tender balladeer of Love Me Tender. And there was the Elvis the Pelvis figure from the Milton Berle and Ed Sullivan shows, the source of so much scandal. These different facets of Elvis coexisted. Jailhouse Rock changed that. The film performance crystallized all the rebellious, dangerous, and sexually charged elements of his persona into a single, iconic, and indelible image. The production number is a masterpiece of branding, whether intentional or not. The costume is simple but perfect, a striped t-shirt and black jeans, the uniform of the 1950s rebel. The setting is gritty and masculine. The choreography is explosive. His attitude is a mix of anger and arrogance. All of these elements came together to create the definitive image of Elvis, the rock and roll king. When people thought of Elvis after this, this is the image that came to mind. It was so powerful that it overshadowed everything else. The polite boy from interviews disappeared. The gentle ballad singer was forgotten. What remained was Vince Everett, the sneering, hip-shaking convict. This consolidation of his image was a double-edged sword. For his millions of young fans, it was electrifying. This was the Elvis they wanted. He was cool, he was tough, he was defiant, he was everything they felt but couldn't express. The Jailhouse Rock image became a symbol for a generation. Boys copied his haircut and his sneer. The song became an anthem of youthful rebellion. It solidified his status not just as a singer, but as a cultural leader. He was the king of their world. For the establishment, this new singular image was far more threatening. Before, they could dismiss him as a passing fad or a novelty act. They could focus on his more palatable qualities. But the Jailhouse Rock image was impossible to ignore or soften. It was pure, undiluted rebellion. It confirmed all their worst fears about him and the music he represented. This was not a harmless entertainer. This was a threat to morality, a catalyst for social decay. The performance gave his critics a clear target. They could point to the screen and say, "See, this is what we've been warning you about." The timing was also crucial. By late 1957, Elvis was at the absolute peak of his early fame. He was an unstoppable cultural force. And then just a few months later, in March 1958, he was inducted into the U.S. Army. His hair was cut, and he was put in a uniform. For 2 years, he was largely absent from the public eye. This meant that the Jailhouse Rock image was the last, most powerful impression he left on the public before his career was put on hold. It was the image that was frozen in time. When he returned in 1960, his music and his image would be softer, more geared towards a family audience. He would spend much of the 1960s making lighthearted musical comedies in Hollywood, but the memory of the Jailhouse Rock performance lingered. It became the benchmark against which everything else he did was measured. It was the moment the legend was forged, and it was an image so powerful that it both defined his career and, in some ways, trapped him. Number 9, why was this song a direct challenge to television's gatekeepers? By 1957, television had become the most powerful medium in American culture, and its gatekeepers were deeply conservative. The men who ran the networks and the sponsors who paid the bills were determined to present a wholesome, family-friendly version of America. This led to strict censorship. Married couples on TV slept in separate twin beds. Profanity was non-existent, and controversial topics were avoided at all costs. Elvis Presley had already had several run-ins with these gatekeepers. His early TV appearances in 1956 had caused a national scandal. After his performance on The Milton Berle Show, where he gyrated his way through Hound Dog, the press exploded with outrage. His critics called him Elvis the Pelvis and described his performance as a striptease. When he was booked for the country's most influential variety show, The Ed Sullivan Show, the controversy reached a fever pitch. Sullivan, a powerful tastemaker, initially said he would never have the vulgar singer on his program, but the ratings potential was too great to ignore. For Elvis's first appearance, Sullivan was recovering from a car accident, and host Charles Laughton instructed the cameramen to keep the shots relatively wide. For his second appearance, Sullivan was back and allowed some closer shots. The audience went wild, and the complaints poured in. This led to one of the most famous moments in television history. For Elvis's third and final appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show in January 1957, Sullivan and the network censors made a decision. Here, Elvis would only be filmed from the waist up. They literally decided to cut his controversial body in half. This act of censorship was a clear message. His movements were too dangerous for the American living room. They could not be shown on television. Jailhouse Rock was released in the fall of 1957 after these television battles had been fought. The film and its title song were, in essence, Elvis's uncensored response. The Jailhouse Rock production number was everything the TV censors had tried to suppress, now magnified on the giant cinema screen. All the hip shaking, leg quivering, and full body convulsions that Ed Sullivan had deemed unfit for broadcast were now the centerpiece of a major Hollywood movie. It was a direct defiance of the TV establishment. It was as if Elvis and his team were saying, you can censor us on your little box, but you can't stop this. The song itself, with its themes of violence and rebellion, would have been a nightmare for television programmers. It's highly unlikely that Elvis would have been allowed to perform the song live on a variety show in 1957 without significant changes or facing the waist-up treatment again. The film became the only place to see the performance as intended. This made going to the cinema an act of rebellion in itself for teenagers. They could see the real, uncensored Elvis that the TV networks were trying to hide from them. This dynamic created a new kind of controversy. It wasn't just about the song or the dance anymore. It was about the battle for control over popular culture. Who decides what is acceptable for the public to see and hear? The conservative TV hosts and network executives, or the artists and the young audiences who adored them? Jailhouse Rock drew a clear line in the sand. It positioned Elvis as a champion of a more liberated, expressive culture, standing against the stiff, fearful censorship of the old guard. The controversy was no longer just about a wiggle. It was about freedom of expression. Number 8, how could a fictional jail party stoke real-world fears? The mid-1950s in America was a time of widespread anxiety about the nation's youth. The term juvenile delinquent became a media obsession. There was a pervasive fear that the younger generation was out of control, disrespectful of authority, and prone to violence and crime. This moral panic was fueled by sensationalist newspaper headlines, congressional hearings, and a wave of popular culture that seemed to confirm these fears. Jailhouse Rock did not create this panic, but it landed in the middle of it like a lit match in a gas station. The song and the film tapped directly into the specific anxieties of the era. The very title, Jailhouse Rock, connected rock and roll music with criminality. The lyrics painted a picture of a prison where the inmates were not repentant, but were instead throwing a party. This trivialized the concept of crime and punishment, making prison seem like a cool, rebellious place to be. For parents who were already worried about their children's behavior, this was terrifying. The song seemed to be actively encouraging a disregard for the law. The character of Vince Everett was the embodiment of the juvenile delinquent archetype. He was angry, misunderstood, and quick to lash out with his fists. He was a product of a broken home and had a deep-seated distrust of authority figures. This was the exact profile that sociologists and law enforcement were warning the public about. By making this character the hero of a major film and having him sing the title song, Hollywood was seen as validating and even glorifying this dangerous personality type. The film Blackboard Jungle had been released 2 years earlier, in 1955. Its use of Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and his Comets is often cited as the moment rock and roll became the official soundtrack of teenage rebellion. Screenings of the film were notorious for teenagers dancing in the aisles and, in some cases, ripping up theater seats. This cemented a powerful association in the public mind: rock and roll music equals riots and youth violence. Jailhouse Rock seemed like a deliberate sequel to this phenomenon. The song itself is about a riotous party, and the film's climax involves a violent fight. It was as if the creators were intentionally stoking the flames of this moral panic. This context is crucial to understanding the level of controversy. The song was not judged in a vacuum. It was judged against a backdrop of national anxiety. It was seen as more than just a piece of music. It was a piece of evidence. It was proof for many adults that their fears were justified. This new music really was a corrupting influence. It really was encouraging kids to be lawless. The controversy wasn't just about taste or morality, it was about social safety. Parents, teachers, and police officers felt they were in a real battle for the hearts and minds of America's youth, and Jailhouse Rock was a powerful weapon for the other side. It gave a voice and a swagger to the very rebellion they were trying to suppress. Number 7 were the songwriters intentionally pushing boundaries. And Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller were not your average Tin Pan Alley songwriters. They were young, highly intelligent, and deeply immersed in the world of rhythm and blues. They were white, but their musical heroes and many of their collaborators were black. They wrote with a wit and a social awareness that was rare in pop music. When they wrote Jailhouse Rock, they were not naive about the potential for controversy. In fact, their entire career was built on pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable in a pop song. Their work with the Coasters is the best example of this. They wrote a string of hits for the group, like Searchin', Young Blood, and Poison Ivy, that were essentially miniature musical plays. These songs were funny, but they were also filled with sly social commentary. They dealt with topics like teenage lust, young blood, the generation gap, yakety yak, and racial stereotypes. They used humor and slang to sneak adult themes and social critiques past the censors and onto the radio. You know, they were masters of lyrical subversion. You know, when they were approached to write for an Elvis movie, they brought this same subversive sensibility to the project. The story goes that their publisher, Gene Aberback, locked them in their New York hotel room and refused to let them out until they had written the songs for the film's soundtrack. In about 5 hours, they wrote Jailhouse Rock, Tret Me Nice, and You're So Square Baby I Don't Care. They saw the film's premise as silly and approached the songwriting with a sense of ironic detachment. They decided to lean into the absurdity of a prison musical. The controversial elements of the lyrics, the violence, the mention of the Purple Gang, the cut-s jailbird line were all part of this ironic approach. They were taking the cliches of tough guy prison movies and twisting them into a rock and roll context. They knew these lines were provocative. The mention of a real-life violent gang was not an accident. The hint of same-sex attraction was not a slip of the pen. These were deliberate choices made by two writers who enjoyed being clever and pushing buttons. They were testing the limits of the mainstream. However, their intent was complex. It's unlikely they set out to create a moral panic. They were likely trying to write a smart, funny, and exciting rock and roll song that would fit the film's B-movie premise. But their definition of smart and funny was far more sophisticated and edgy than that of the average listener in 1957. They were writing from a hipper, more cynical perspective. They understood the power of language and imagery to provoke a reaction. The controversy arose because the irony was lost in translation. When their lyrics were delivered by the deadly serious and charismatic Elvis Presley, the humor was stripped away. All that was left was the provocation. Elvis performed the song with such conviction that the audience took every word literally. The clever social commentary of Lieber and Stoller was transformed into a direct rebellious statement by its performer. So, while the songwriters may have been intentionally pushing boundaries with their clever wordplay, it was Elvis's performance that turned their subtle provocations into a full-blown cultural controversy. They loaded the gun, but Elvis pulled the trigger. Number 6, why was the UK's reaction even harsher than America's? While Jailhouse Rock caused a significant stir in the United States, its reception in the United Kingdom was, in some ways, even more fraught with controversy. The song and the film arrived in a post-war Britain that was still grappling with austerity, social conservatism, and the emergence of its own rebellious youth culture, the Teddy Boys. The arrival of Elvis's brand of raw American rock and roll was seen by the British establishment as a dangerous foreign invasion. The song was released in the UK in January 1958 and shot to number 1, becoming the first record ever to enter the British charts at the top spot. Its commercial success was immediate and immense, but the cultural backlash was just as swift. The BBC, the state-run broadcasting corporation that held a monopoly on the radio airwaves, initially refused to play the song. Their reasoning was that the song's lyrics, particularly the line number 47, said to number 3, glorified violence and law-breaking. The BBC had a strict code of conduct and saw it as their duty to protect the public from what they considered to be immoral or corrupting influences. This ban by the country's most powerful media outlet turned the song into forbidden fruit, making it even more desirable to young people. When the film was released, the controversy escalated. The British Board of Film Censors BBFC was known for being even more stringent than its American counterparts. They demanded cuts to the film. The scene where Vince Everett Elvis is beaten in prison was shortened, but the most significant censorship was aimed at the Jailhouse Rock number itself. The BBFC objected to the sequence where Vince uses a prison pole to slide down from the upper tier of the cell block. They found the movement to be suggestive and a dangerous incitement. Like, the idea was that this move could be copied by impressionable youths, leading to injury or riotous behavior. They also objected to the general level of aggression and violence in the dance. The reaction from the British press was often hysterical. Tabloid newspapers ran headlines warning of the dangerous influence of Elvis and rock and roll. They linked the music to the rise of the teddy boy subculture, who were often depicted as violent, knife-wielding hooligans. Jailhouse Rock, with its prison setting and violent undertones, was seen as the teddy boys' perfect anthem. The film was blamed for inciting copycat behavior, and there were reports of minor disturbances and vandalism at theaters where it was showing. This harsh reaction can be understood in the context of Britain's unique social situation. The country was still recovering from the trauma of World War II, and there was a strong desire for social order and a return to traditional values. The sudden explosion of American-style consumer culture and rebellious youth music was deeply unsettling to an establishment that valued restraint and decorum. Jailhouse Rock was not just a song, it was a symbol of a loud, brash, and uncontrollable American culture that seemed to be eroding the foundations of British society. The controversy in the UK was less about the specifics of the lyrics and more about a broader fear of cultural change and the loss of a traditional British way of life. Number 5, did a medical professional really condemn the dance? The controversy surrounding Elvis's dancing was not just confined to the opinions of music critics and concerned parents. In a fascinating and bizarre chapter of the Jailhouse Rock story, the criticism escalated to the level of supposed scientific and medical authority. In the mid-1950s, as the moral panic around rock and roll grew, a Canadian psychiatrist named Dr. Francis Braceland began to make headlines with his pronouncements on the dangers of the new music. He became one of the key expert voices used by the establishment to lend credibility to their attacks on Elvis. Dr. Braceland was a prominent figure, a former president of the American Psychiatric Association. He argued that rock and roll music, with its heavy, repetitive beat, was not harmless entertainment. He claimed it was a cannibalistic and tribalistic form of music that had a dangerous effect on the teenage mind. He suggested that the rhythm itself could bypass the rational parts of the brain and appeal directly to primitive urges, leading to a loss of emotional control and immoral behavior. In his view, listening to rock and roll was a form of self-induced hysteria. When it came to Elvis's dancing, Dr. Braceland's analysis became even more specific and alarming. He described Elvis's movements, particularly the gyrations seen in performances like Jailhouse Rock, as a symptom of a serious psychological problem. He used clinical-sounding language to describe the dancing as a morbid manifestation of adolescent rebellion and linked it to antisocial behavior. He essentially gave a medical diagnosis to a cultural phenomenon. His expert opinion was that Elvis's performance style was not just vulgar, it was psychologically unhealthy and could trigger dangerous emotional responses in his young audience. This psychiatric condemnation was incredibly powerful. It moved the argument against Elvis from the realm of taste and morality into the realm of science and public health. It was no longer just a matter of not liking his music. It was a matter of protecting the mental and emotional well-being of the nation's youth. Dr. Braceland's quotes were picked up by newspapers and magazines across North America. He was presented as an objective, scientific voice of reason, warning against a genuine public health threat. This medicalization of the controversy was a new and potent weapon for Elvis's critics. It allowed them to frame their opposition not as old-fashioned conservatism, but as a modern, enlightened concern for adolescent psychology. They could argue that they weren't trying to censor art, they were trying to prevent a mental health crisis. Of course, this scientific analysis was deeply flawed and rooted in cultural bias and a fear of the unknown. Dr. Braceland was interpreting a new cultural expression through the lens of his own conservative values and pathologizing it. But in the anxious climate of the 1950s, his diagnosis found a receptive audience and added a seemingly legitimate scientific layer to the controversy surrounding Jailhouse Rock. It suggested that the danger of Elvis was not just cultural, but biological. Number 4. How did the recording session itself create a legendary sound? The controversy of Jailhouse Rock is often focused on the lyrics and the visual performance, but the sound of the record itself was a radical departure from the norm, and the story of its creation is a key part of its legend. The recording session, which took place on April 30th, 1957 at Radio Recorders in Hollywood, was a clash of old and new Hollywood, and it produced a sound that was intentionally aggressive and bigger than life. The key figures in the studio were Elvis, his band, Scotty Moore on guitar, Bill Black on bass, DJ Fontana on drums, and the songwriter-producer duo of Lieber and Stoller. Mike Stoller, in particular, played a crucial role. He played the pounding piano part on the record. But his most significant contribution was his insistence on a specific sound. According to Stoller, when he first heard the playback of the rhythm track, he felt something was missing. The drum sound wasn't powerful enough for him. He wanted a sound that was sharp, loud, and almost violent to match the song's theme. In a moment that has become part of rock and roll lore, Stoller had an idea. He told the engineer that he wanted a drum sound that was like a gunshot or a crack of a whip. The engineer was baffled. The conventional wisdom in 1957 was to record drums with a soft, blended sound that sat back in the mix. Stoller's demand for a loud, aggressive, in-your-face drum sound was unheard of. To achieve this, DJ Fontana reportedly placed a microphone closer to his snare drum than was standard practice. More importantly, it's been said that during the take, to get an even more percussive and explosive sound, one of the band members, or Stoller himself, would strike a spare snare drum or a drum case with a stick at key moments, particularly on the Big Bang, sounds that punctuate the stop time breaks. This created a massive, cracking sound that could not be achieved by a single drummer alone. This focus on creating an aggressive, almost dangerous sound extended to the rest of the production. As mentioned earlier, the use of two basses created a thick, powerful low end. Scotty Moore's guitar riff is sharp and distorted, not clean and polite. And then there was Elvis's vocal. Lieber and Stoller pushed him to deliver a performance that was raw and full of attitude. They didn't want the smooth balladeer, they wanted the snarling rebel. The result was a record that sounded fundamentally different from almost everything else on the radio. It was loud, it was heavy, and it had a physical impact on the listener. Like, this unique, aggressive sound was itself a form of controversy. It violated the unwritten rules of pop music production. It was too hot, too in the red. It didn't sound polished or refined, it sounded like a brawl. The sonic assault was just as unsettling to many listeners as the lyrical content or the dancing. It was the sound of something new and untamed breaking through the smooth, controlled surface of mainstream pop. The story of the recording session reveals that the song's controversial nature was not an accident. It was a result of deliberate artistic choices made by a group of innovators who were determined to create a sound that was as rebellious and exciting as the subject matter itself. Number 3 was the song part of a broader cultural Cold War. To fully understand the depth of the controversy surrounding Jailhouse Rock, it's important to place it within the larger context of the Cold War. The 1950s was the height of the ideological battle between the United States and the Soviet Union. This wasn't just a military and political struggle, it was a cultural one. The United States promoted an image of itself as a stable, moral, and prosperous society, a bastion of freedom and traditional family values. This wholesome image was a key weapon in its ideological war against godless communism. Anything that seemed to undermine this carefully constructed image of American strength and moral purity was seen as a potential threat. And rock and roll, with Elvis Presley as its king, was viewed by some powerful figures as a serious internal threat. The music was seen as decadent and chaotic. It promoted rebellion against authority, a loosening of sexual morals, and a breakdown of racial barriers. These were all things that, in the minds of some Cold War hardliners, weakened the nation from within, making it more vulnerable to its external enemies. Jailhouse Rock was the perfect embodiment of this perceived threat. The song's glorification of criminals, its hints of violence, and its raw, untamed energy were the complete opposite of the clean-cut, conformist image that the government and the establishment wanted to project to the world. The performance, with its lead dancing, was a direct contradiction of the nation's supposed moral superiority. How could America claim to be a virtuous society when its biggest cultural export was a sneering rebel singing about a prison riot? This anxiety was not just a domestic issue. The Soviet Union and its allies seized on rock and roll as an example of Western decadence and capitalist decay. Their state-controlled media portrayed the music as a symptom of a sick society, a tool used to distract and corrupt the youth. They would point to the hysteria surrounding Elvis and the moral panic described in the American press as proof that the American system was unstable and chaotic. In this charged atmosphere, the controversy over Jailhouse Rock took on a political dimension. Attacking Elvis became a way for conservative politicians and commentators to demonstrate their patriotism and their commitment to traditional American values. Defending him became a way for young people to rebel, not just against their parents, but against the stiff, conformist culture of the Cold War era. The song was more than just a song. It was a cultural battleground where different visions of America were fighting for supremacy. The fear was that the Jailhouse Rock ethos of rebellion and nonconformity could be a kind of cultural virus weakening the nation's moral fiber and resolve in its global struggle against communism. It sounds extreme today, but in the paranoid climate of the 1950s, a pop song could be seen as a matter of national security. Number 2. Did the tragedy surrounding the film add to its notoriety? While most of the controversy surrounding Jailhouse Rock stemmed from its content and performance, a real-life tragedy connected to the film cast a dark shadow over it and added to its notoriety. This tragedy involved Elvis's co-star Judy Tyler, who played his love interest, Peggy Van Alden. Tyler was a promising young actress, and Jailhouse Rock was set to be her big break into major stardom. Filming for Jailhouse Rock wrapped in the summer of 1957. On July 3rd, 1957, just a few weeks after completing her work on the film, Judy Tyler and her husband, actor Greg Lafayette, were driving from Hollywood back to their home in New York. While traveling through Wyoming, they were involved in a horrific car accident. Another car swerved into their lane, resulting in a head-on collision. Judy Tyler, who was only 24 years old, was killed instantly. Her husband died the following day. The news of her death was a devastating blow to the cast and crew of the film, and especially to Elvis. He and Tyler had become close friends during the production. By all accounts, Elvis was completely shattered by the news. He was so distraught that he could not bring himself to attend the premiere of the film later that year. In fact, for the rest of his life, he famously refused to ever watch the movie Jailhouse Rock because it was too painful a reminder of the loss of his friend. This tragic event, while not a controversy in the traditional sense, became inextricably linked with the film's legacy. When Jailhouse Rock was released in November 1957, audiences were watching a vibrant, talented young actress on the cusp of stardom, knowing that she was already gone. This added a layer of profound sadness and morbidity to the viewing experience. The film was no longer just a rebellious rock and roll musical, it was also a posthumous tribute to its leading lady. For some, this real-life tragedy amplified the film's dangerous reputation. The story of a wild, rebellious film being marked by a real-life death fed into a narrative that the project was somehow cursed or ill-fated. It blurred the lines between on-screen drama and off-screen tragedy, making the entire Jailhouse Rock phenomenon feel more intense and significant. While the moral controversies were about perceived dangers, the death of Judy Tyler was a real and tangible tragedy. It gave the film a weight and a darkness that went far beyond suggestive dancing or rebellious lyrics, forever marking Jailhouse Rock as a landmark in Elvis's career, not just for its cultural impact, but for the profound personal loss associated with it. Number one, why was the ultimate controversy simply Elvis himself? After examining all the specific elements of the lyrics, the sound, the dance, the social context, we arrive at the central reason why Jailhouse Rock was so controversial. The ultimate controversy was Elvis Presley himself. He was a force of nature that 1950s America was simply not prepared for. The song and the film performance were not the cause of the controversy. They were the perfect vessel for a controversy that already surrounded him. Any song he sang with that level of energy would have been attacked. Any movie role where he didn't play a perfectly wholesome character would have been condemned. Elvis represented a fundamental shift in culture. He was the embodiment of a new, youth-driven world that was terrifying to the established order. He was a white man from the segregated South who sounded and moved like a black man. He was a working-class kid who became richer and more famous than presidents. He was sexually charismatic in a way that was overt and unapologetic at a time when sexuality was meant to be repressed and hidden. He didn't just break the rules, he seemed completely unaware that the rules existed. Jailhouse Rock was the moment all these controversial elements converged into one perfect, explosive package. The song's rebellious theme was the perfect match for his rebellious persona. The aggressive sound was the perfect match for his raw energy. The prison setting was the perfect backdrop for his image as a cultural outlaw. The sexually charged choreography was the ultimate expression of the physical charisma that had made him a star and a scandal. He wasn't just performing a song, he was performing an idea of himself, and that idea was the source of all the trouble. Think of it this way. If Pat Boone had recorded Jailhouse Rock, it would have been a novelty song, a silly joke. It would have caused no controversy at all. But when Elvis sang it, the lyrics about prison fights and gangs sounded real. The sneer in his voice felt genuine. The movements of his body seemed to come from a place of authentic, untamed impulse. He had a unique ability to make performance feel like reality. This is what made him so thrilling to his fans and so threatening to his detractors. They believed what they were seeing. They believed that this angry, gyrating, lawless character on the screen was the real Elvis Presley. In the end, all the arguments over the lyrics, the dancing, and the music were just stand-ins for the real argument, which was about Elvis himself and what he represented. He was a social and cultural revolution in the body of one man. Jailhouse Rock was not just a song, it was his declaration of independence from the bland, conformist culture of the 1950s. It was the moment he became more than a singer. He became a symbol. And it was the power of that symbol, the symbol of rebellion, of sex, of racial and cultural fusion, that made Jailhouse Rock the most controversial and arguably the most important single performance of his entire career.